Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the truth was buried deeper than the bodies themselves. I'm your guide through these darkest chronicles, and tonight we're traveling back to 1865, to a town that made a choice so disturbing it would haunt generations to come. Before we begin, I want to know where you are right now. Tell me in the comments below. What time is it where you're watching this? Are you alone in your room at midnight, sitting in a coffee shop in broad daylight? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow me down this particular rabbit hole, and when. Drop a comment and let our community know you're here. Now let me ask you something. What would it take for an entire town to agree to erase a family from history? Not just from memory, but from every official record, every church registry, every documented trace of their existence. What kind of horror would justify such a collective act of erasure? March 1865. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a township of barely 300 souls, nestled deep in the Allegheny Plateau, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to swallow the sunlight whole. The Civil War was entering its final blood-soaked weeks. Sherman had burned his way through the South, and the nation was drowning in death on an industrial scale. In places like Millbrook, far from the battlefields, people were just trying to survive another harsh winter, to keep their farms alive, to pray that their sons wouldn't come home in wooden boxes. The Ashford family lived 3 miles outside of town, on a property that backed up against the old-growth forest. William Ashford, 42 years old, a carpenter by trade. His wife, Catherine, 38, known throughout the county for her herb garden and healing remedies. Their 5 children, Margaret, 16, and engaged to be married that summer. Thomas, 14, already working alongside his father. Elizabeth, 11, Samuel, 8, and Grace, just 4 years old, with blonde curls that caught the light like spun gold. By all accounts, they were unremarkable. Quiet, kept to themselves but weren't unfriendly. They attended church most Sundays, paid their debts, caused no trouble. On March 15, 1865, a neighbor named Henry Corbett rode out to the Ashford property to discuss a lumber order with William. He would later tell the town council that he noticed something immediately wrong. The chickens were dead in their coop. The cow was bellowing in pain, hadn't been milked in what looked like days. The front door was standing open, which was unusual for March, when the cold still bit hard. Henry called out. No answer. He stepped inside. What he found in that house, he would never fully describe. Not to his wife, not to the minister, not even years later on his deathbed, when men are supposed to confess their deepest truths. He rode back to town, got the constable and the doctor, and led them back to the Ashford property in silence. By nightfall, on March 15th, every able-bodied man in Millbrook had seen what was inside that house. By midnight, a decision had been made. The Reverend Jonas Whitmore, Constable Peter Walsh, and the town's 3 leading families held an emergency meeting in the church basement. No minutes were recorded, no official documentation was created, but by dawn on March 16th, the Ashford family was gone. All 7 of them, buried in unmarked graves in unconsecrated ground, half a mile into the forest, far from the church cemetery where good Christians were laid to rest. The house was burned to its foundation. Every personal belonging, every letter, every photograph, every Bible with family names inscribed was thrown into the flames. The town's official records were altered. The Ashfords' names were scratched out of the church registry with such violence that the pages tore. And then came the silence, a silence that would last for 87 years. But what the town found inside that house would force them to make a decision no community should ever have to make. And the question that has haunted researchers, historians, and descendants ever since is simply this: what could possibly justify erasing an entire family from existence? Let's find out. To understand what happened in Millbrook, we need to understand the world that shaped it. March 1865 was a strange time to be alive in rural Pennsylvania. The Civil War had been raging for 4 years, and while the state itself saw no major battles, after Gettysburg in 1863, the psychological scars ran deep. Nearly every family in townships like Millbrook had lost someone. Sons, fathers, brothers. The absence was everywhere, like missing teeth in a smile. Millbrook was founded in 1798 by Quaker settlers, though by the 1860s the population had diversified. German immigrants, Scots-Irish farmers, a handful of Welsh coal miners who'd moved inland when the mines played out. The 1860 census, one of the few surviving documents we have, lists the population at 287 souls. By 1870, that number had dropped to 212. Wars do that to small towns, but so does fear. The township sat in a valley carved out by glaciers 10,000 years before, surrounded on 3 sides by steep, forested hills. There was one road in and one road out, a rutted path that turned to soup every spring and froze solid every winter. The nearest city of any size was Altoona, 32 miles southeast, a journey that took 2 days by wagon in good weather. In practical terms, Millbrook was an island. What happened there stayed there. The town's social structure was typical for rural Pennsylvania at the time. The Blackwell family owned the general store and served as the unofficial bank. The Pritchards ran the gristmill. The Langfords controlled most of the good farmland. These 3 families, along with Reverend Whitmore and Constable Walsh, effectively governed Millbrook. Town meetings were held, votes were counted, but everyone knew where the real power lay. Religion dominated daily life, but it was a peculiar mixture of formal Protestantism and older beliefs that had crossed the Atlantic with immigrants from Scotland and Germany. The church was Methodist, officially, but talk to the old women who gathered to quilt, and you'd hear about signs and omens, red skies, crows gathering in unusual numbers, children born with calls over their faces, trees that grew in strange patterns. This was Appalachian country, where the forest was old and deep, and people still remembered that some things lived in the woods that weren't in any Bible. According to the few surviving letters from that period, housed now in the Pennsylvania State Archives, winters in Millbrook were brutal exercises in survival. Families were isolated on their farms for months at a time. Supplies ran low. Cabin fever set in. When someone died in January or February, the ground was too frozen to dig graves, so bodies were kept in root cellars or barns until the spring thaw. Death was intimate, visible. There was no mortuary to take the bodies away, no professionals to handle the unpleasant realities. You washed your own dead, you built your own coffins, you buried your own children. The Ashford family fit into this world quietly. William had moved to Millbrook in 1847, according to a land deed that survived in the county records. He purchased 80 acres at the edge of the township boundary for $120. The property was considered undesirable because it bordered the old-growth forest, and local superstition held that building too close to the tree line brought bad luck. But William was a practical man, and the land was cheap. Catherine came from a family of German immigrants who'd settled in the valley 2 generations back. Her maiden name was Schneider, and her family had a reputation for folk medicine. Herbal remedies, poultices, treatments for fever and infection. In a place where the nearest doctor might be days away, this knowledge was valuable. Women would ride out to the Ashford farm with sick children, and Catherine would brew teas or make salves. She never charged money, only accepted trades: eggs, flour, a cut of pork. The Ashford children were, by all surviving accounts, normal. Margaret was considered beautiful, and her engagement to Thomas Langford, the mill owner's second son, was seen as a good match. Thomas, the eldest Ashford boy, was learning his father's carpentry trade. The younger children attended the township school when weather permitted, though education was sporadic at best. One detail appears in multiple sources, and it's worth noting. The Ashford's property backed directly against what locals called the deep woods, a section of forest that had never been logged, never been fully explored. The trees there were massive, ancient, their canopy so thick that even in summer, the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. Hunters avoided it. There were stories, of course. Every deep forest has stories. Things seen moving between trees that walked on two legs but weren't quite human. Sounds that didn't match any known animal. Travelers who went in and came out changed, speaking in tongues or struck mute. Whether the Ashfords believed these stories, we don't know. What we do know is that William had built his house with the back of the structure facing the forest, and every window on that side was fitted with heavy shutters that could be barred from the inside. When asked about this unusual architectural choice, William supposedly told a neighbor it was for the wind. But the Allegheny Plateau gets its harshest winds from the west, not the east, where the forest stood. In the winter of 1864-1865, two events occurred that would later seem significant. First, Reverend Whitmore's journal, discovered decades later in his granddaughter's attic, contains this entry from December 23, 1864. Spoke with Catherine. Ashford, after service. She seemed troubled, asked about protection prayers, would not elaborate on what she feared, told her to trust in the Lord's mercy. She did not seem comforted. Second, the Millbrook Town Council meeting minutes from January 14, 1865, record a complaint filed by Herman Schneider, Catherine's brother, requesting that the constable investigate disturbances at the Ashford property. The nature of these disturbances is not specified, and there's no record of any investigation being conducted. And then, on March 15, 1865, Henry Corbett rode out to discuss lumber prices and found a scene that would change Millbrook forever. What he discovered in that house, what all those men saw that day, was never officially recorded, but in the weeks and months that followed, fragments would slip out. Whispers in the general store, drunken confessions at the tavern, a wife overhearing her husband's nightmares, the pieces of a puzzle that even today has never been completely solved. Henry Corbett was 53 years old when he rode out to the Ashford farm that March morning, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a farmer, a man not easily rattled. His grandson, in a 1934 interview with the Altoona Mirror newspaper, recalled that his grandfather never spoke of what he saw that day, but he did say this: "After March 15th, Grandpa Henry never slept with the lights off again. Not once in the remaining 22 years of his life. The ride from town to the Ashford property took about 40 minutes on horseback. The weather was typical for mid-March in Pennsylvania, cold but clear, patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed places. Henry later told Constable Walsh that as he approached the property, he noticed the silence first. No dog barking, no sounds of children, just the wind moving through the bare trees. The chickens in the coop were dead, but not from predation. They lay scattered across the floor, necks unbroken, no visible injuries. Later examination would reveal they'd simply died, all at once, as if something had stopped their hearts simultaneously. The cow in the barn was in distress, her udders swollen and leaking, clearly not milked in several days. The animal's eyes, Henry noted, were rolling white with terror. The front door stood open. This detail appears in every account. In March, in Pennsylvania, in a house heated by a single fireplace, no one leaves the front door open. Henry called out from the porch, "William, Catherine?" No response. He stepped inside. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. The fireplace was cold, ashes days old. A pot of something, now spoiled and covered in mold, sat on the table. Plates were laid out as if for a meal that was never eaten. 3 chairs were overturned. The Bible that typically sat on the mantel was on the floor, pages torn out. Henry found the first body in the children's bedroom upstairs. Grace, the 4-year-old, lying in her small bed as if asleep. No visible injuries, no signs of struggle, just a small child who had stopped breathing. He found the others throughout the house. Catherine in the master bedroom, sitting upright in a chair facing the window that looked out toward the forest. Margaret in the hallway outside her room. The 3 boys, Thomas, Samuel, and Elizabeth, in various locations, all positioned strangely as if they'd died while trying to reach something or flee from something. William was found. Last, in the root cellar. What struck Henry immediately was that William had barricaded himself down there. The cellar door, which opened from the inside, had been blocked with bags of grain and preserved food, as if he'd been trying to keep something out, or himself in. William's body was curled in the far corner, his hands bloody and raw, the stone walls around him covered in scratch marks where he'd clawed at the foundation. Henry mounted his horse and rode for town, without bothering to close the door behind him. Within 2 hours, Constable Peter Walsh, Dr. Edmund Pierce, and Reverend Jonas Whitmore arrived at the property. By late afternoon, they'd been joined by the town's leading men. Jonathan Blackwell from the general store, Robert Pritchard, who owned the mill, and George Langford, the largest landowner in the valley. Dr. Pierce's official examination, according to a fragment of his notes discovered in 1963, listed cause of death as unknown natural causes for all 7 family members. But his personal journal, found by his great-grandson in 1978, tells a different story. In an entry dated March 15, 1865, Pierce wrote, "No disease known to medical science could account for this. No poison displays these symptoms. Whatever killed this family did not originate from any earthly source I can identify. God have mercy on us all." The condition of the bodies was unusual, despite being dead for what appeared to be several days. Based on the state of decomposition and the cold fireplace, there was no rigor mortis. The bodies were flexible, almost warm to the touch. Their eyes were open, and in several cases, according to Pierce's notes, the pupils were fully dilated, as if they'd died in complete darkness. But it was what the men found throughout the house that truly disturbed them. Symbols, carved into the wood. Not painted, not drawn, but carved deep into the door frames, the window sills, the walls themselves. Reverend Whitmore, who had studied theology at Princeton and had access to extensive religious texts, could not identify them. They weren't Latin, weren't Greek, weren't Hebrew. They weren't any Native American pictographs he'd encountered. They were intricate, deliberate, and they covered nearly every surface of the house. In the attic, they found Catherine's workroom, where she prepared her herbal remedies. The entire space had been destroyed. Jars were smashed, dried herbs were scattered, and on the floor, drawn in what appeared to be ash, mixed with something darker, was a large circle with more of the unknown symbols radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. The Ashford family Bible, its pages torn and scattered across the floor, had specific passages underlined in what looked like dried blood. Exodus 22:18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." Leviticus 20:27, "A man also or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death." Deuteronomy 18:10-12. The passages about divination and necromancy were circled so violently the pen had torn through the paper. In William's carpentry workshop, they found his tools arranged in a perfect circle on the workbench. In the center of that circle was a dead crow, its head removed, placed where its tail should be. The children's school books had been burned in the fireplace, but not completely. Fragments remained, and on these fragments, in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting, were more symbols, drawn obsessively in the margins. covering every available space. As the sun began to set on March 15th, the men stood in the yard of the Ashford house and faced a decision. Dr. Pierce wanted to transport the bodies to Altoona for further examination. Reverend Whitmore insisted on Christian burial in the church cemetery. Several of the townsmen argued for notifying the county authorities. But Jonathan Blackwell, the wealthiest man in Millbrook, raised a different concern. "If word gets out," he said, according to a deathbed confession his grandson made to a local newspaper in 1952, "this town is finished. Who'll trade with us, who'll marry into our families, who'll buy our land, will be known as the cursed town, the evil place. Everything we've built will be destroyed." George Langford agreed. His son was engaged to Margaret Ashford. The connection to his family, to his name, was unacceptable. "We bury them tonight," he said. "We burn the house. We never speak of this again." Constable Walsh, who should have objected, who should have protected the law, remained silent. Reverend Whitmore protested, but weakly. The symbols, the apparent occult activity, had shaken his faith in ways he couldn't articulate. "If Catherine was involved in witchcraft," he said, "then perhaps unconsecrated ground is appropriate." By midnight on March 15th in torchlight, 17 men dug a mass grave half a mile into the forest. No coffins were built. The bodies were wrapped in canvas and lowered into the earth. No prayers were spoken. No markers were placed. The house was burned before dawn. Tell us in the comments what you think happened so far. Do you think Catherine was practicing something she shouldn't have been? Was this a murder made to look like something supernatural? Or was there something else in that house, something that came from the forest? Share your theories below, because what we're about to uncover gets much, much darker. And then, on March 19th, 1865, the screaming stopped, because that's when they realized the Ashfords might not have been the only victims. In the 4 days following the burial of the Ashford family, Millbrook existed in a state of enforced normalcy. The men who had witnessed the scene, who had dug the grave, who had burned the house, went about their daily business with rigid determination. They ploughed fields, they conducted trade. They attended church on Sunday, March 19th, and listened to Reverend Whitmore deliver a sermon about Job's trials and the inscrutability of God's will. But underneath this facade, something was breaking. Martha Corbett, Henry's wife, kept a diary. It was discovered in 1981 by a Historical Society researcher going through estate donations. The entry for March 17, 1865, reads, "Henry will not tell me what he saw, but he checks the doors 7 times before bed now. He has taken to sleeping with his rifle. This morning I found him standing at the window, staring toward the forest. When I touched his shoulder, he flinched as if struck. Something has broken in my husband, and I fear it cannot be mended." On March 18th, a farmer named Wilhelm Brenner failed to show up at the mill to collect his grain. His farm was 2 miles north of town, in the opposite direction from the Ashford property. When Constable Walsh rode out to check on him that afternoon, he found Brenner's cabin empty. The animals were gone. Personal belongings had been hastily packed. On the kitchen table was a note. "I will not stay in a town that tolerates such evil. May God forgive you all." Brenner was never seen again. That same evening, Dr. Edmund Pierce was called to the home of Sarah Pritchard, wife of the mill owner. She had collapsed during dinner, screaming about faces in the windows and things that walked like men but were not men. Pierce administered laudanum and diagnosed hysteria brought on by stress. But in his journal, he wrote, "She described them exactly as Catherine Ashford did 3 months ago when she came to my office requesting sleeping powders. The same details, the same terror. I told no one of Catherine's visit then, and I cannot speak of it now, but the correlation troubles me deeply." On March 19th, the town held a meeting. Every adult in Millbrook was expected to attend. What was discussed there has been pieced together from multiple sources: whispered conversations, letters, deathbed confessions. The official meeting minutes from that night, kept in the township records, contain only this: general town business, votes on spring planting schedules, meeting adjourned at 9 p.m. But according to a letter written in 1901 by Rebecca Langford, George Langford's daughter-in-law, who heard the story from her husband on his deathbed, the real agenda was different. The men who had seen the Ashford house stood before the community and made a demand. Everyone would swear an oath of silence. Anyone who spoke of the Ashfords to outsiders would be exiled from the town. Their names would be struck from all records. It would be as if the family had never existed. The vote was unanimous, or so it was recorded. But Rebecca's letter continues. My husband told me that 3 families left Millbrook within the week. They simply packed their belongings and disappeared into the night. The Schneiders, who were Catherine's blood relatives, the Hoffmans, who had been friendly with the Ashfords, and the young couple, the Porters, who had just married the previous fall. When people asked where they'd gone, they were told the families had moved west for better opportunities. But my husband saw their faces when they loaded their wagons. They weren't seeking opportunity, they were fleeing terror. What the town didn't know was that Catherine Ashford had kept detailed records, years of them, and Dr. Pierce had some of those records in his possession. In 1963, during the demolition of the old Pierce family home in Altoona, workers discovered a metal lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been Edmund Pierce's study. Inside were documents that Pierce had apparently smuggled out of the Ashford house before it was burned. Why he took them, why he hid them, why he never revealed their existence even as he grew old and infirm, remains unknown. The documents were badly damaged by moisture and time, but enough survived to be analyzed. The collection included a ledger in Catherine's handwriting, listing names, dates, and symptoms. It appeared to be her record of people she'd treated with herbal remedies over the years. The entries dated back to 1850 and continued until February 1865, just weeks before the family's death. The final entries were disturbing in their escalation. February 3rd, Mrs. Keller, severe nightmares, visions of deceased husband speaking to her from the forest, prepared valerian and chamomile, ineffective. February 10th, young Thomas Brenner, aged 9, claims something calls his name from the tree line at night. Mother reports, child walks in sleep toward the woods, must be restrained, prepared iron water and protection sachet, condition worsening. A series of letters, all unsigned, all written in different hands, dating from December 1864 to February 1865. The letters were pleas for help. Please, you must stop whatever you have started. My daughter sees things that are not there. She draws symbols she cannot have learned. She speaks in a language that sounds like grinding stones. Another. The animals are dying. Not from disease, they simply stop, as if their spirits have been pulled from their bodies. Whatever you have done, whatever door you have opened, close it, before we are all lost. A partial journal in what appeared to be William Ashford's handwriting. The surviving pages were fragmentary, but the content was coherent enough to understand. January 15th, 1865. Catherine insists the rituals are for protection, but I have seen what comes to our windows at night. No Christian prayer could summon such things. I have demanded she stop, but she says it is too late now. They have been invited, and they will not leave until they are satisfied. January 28th. The children see them too. Little Grace woke screaming last night, said there were black men made of smoke standing around her bed. Not men, not smoke, something older, something that should not be. I have begun sleeping in the root cellar. At least there, with earth above and below, I feel safer. February 24th. I found Catherine in the attic this morning, surrounded by her symbols and her herbs and her candles, speaking to something I could not see, but I felt it. The temperature in the room was like January ice, though the fire downstairs was roaring. When I confronted her, she turned to me with eyes I did not recognize and said, "They promised protection, William. They promised our family would survive the darkness coming, but they require payment." I asked what payment. She would not answer. The final entry, dated March 10th, was barely legible. "It is here in the house with us. We cannot leave. Every door we open leads back inside. The windows show us the forest, but when we break the glass, there is only wall behind it. Catherine weeps and says she is sorry. She did not understand what she was bargaining with. The children are quiet now. Too quiet. Grace has stopped speaking altogether. Margaret stares at the walls and traces the symbols with her fingers, over and over. I do not think we will survive. This, if anyone finds this, burn everything. Let no one know what my wife has done." In 1978, a woman named Anna Schmidt gave an interview to a graduate student researching Appalachian folklore. Anna was 94 years old, living in a nursing home in Harrisburg. The interview was recorded and later transcribed. The student had no idea what she was about to uncover. Anna's maiden name was Anna Schneider. She was Catherine Ashford's niece, the daughter of Hermann Schneider, who had filed that mysterious complaint about disturbances at the Ashford property in January 1865. According to Anna's testimony, her father had tried to intervene in the months before the tragedy. Papa said Aunt Catherine had gotten involved with something she shouldn't have. There were old women in the valley, women who knew the old ways from the old country, German folk magic, hexerai they called it, protection spells, healing charms, ways to ward off evil. Most of it was harmless. Superstition mixed with herbal knowledge. But Papa said Catherine had gone deeper than that. She'd found books, old books that came from somewhere else, books that taught different things. Anna claimed her father confronted Catherine in December 1864. He rode out to her house and demanded she stop whatever she was doing. She told him she was protecting her family, that something was coming, something dark, and she needed to make bargains to keep her children safe. Papa asked what she meant by bargains. She wouldn't say, but she showed him the symbols she'd carved into the house. She said they were seals, protections, ways to bind things that wanted to cross over. Papa told her she was playing with forces she didn't understand. She told him it was too late. The bindings were already in place, and breaking them now would be worse than maintaining them. What Catherine didn't tell her brother, Anna revealed, was that the protections required offerings. Not chickens or crops, not the kind of offerings you read about in Bible stories. These required something else. Papa found out later, after everything happened. He found a ledger in Catherine's own hand, buried in the ashes of the house. The constable and the reverend never saw it because Papa took it and burned it himself. But before he did, he read it, and what he read destroyed him. The interviewer asked what was in the ledger. Anna's response was chilling. Aunt Catherine had been making offerings for 2 years. She'd started small. Dead animals she found in the woods, then animals she raised herself. By the fall of 1864, the offerings had escalated. Papa wouldn't tell me details, but he said the symbols Catherine carved, the rituals she performed, they required life. Fresh life. And when you start feeding something like that, it grows hungry. It demands more, and it doesn't care where that life comes from. The interview ends abruptly there. According to the graduate student's notes, Anna became extremely agitated and refused to continue. She died 6 weeks later. The recording is housed in the Pennsylvania Folklore Archive at Penn State University. The most disturbing revelation came from an unexpected source. In 1952, during construction of State Route 164, which was being built to connect Millbrook to the modern highway system, excavation crews made a discovery that brought the Ashford case back into public consciousness. A backhoe operator named James Thornton was clearing forest land about half a mile east of where the old Ashford property had stood. The bucket of his machine struck something that wasn't earth or rock. When crews investigated, they found human remains. Not recent, very old, buried in a mass grave. The county coroner was called. State police investigators arrived. What they uncovered was documented in official reports that are now part of the Pennsylvania State Police archives. 12 bodies, not 7. 12. The remains were badly decomposed, but forensic analysis suggested they had been buried sometime in the mid-1860s. 7 of the bodies appeared to be a family group, 2 adults, 5 children of varying ages. These were assumed to be the Ashfords, though without dental records or DNA testing, which didn't exist in 1952, positive identification was impossible. But there were 5 additional bodies, 3 adults and 2 children. Their positioning in the grave was strange. Unlike the Ashford family, who had been laid out relatively carefully, these 5 were jumbled as if thrown in hastily. And there was another detail that troubled investigators. These bodies showed signs of trauma. Blunt force wounds to the skulls, broken bones, evidence of violence. The coroner's report noted something else. The 5 extra bodies were wearing clothing that didn't match the 1860s period. The fabric, the stitching, the style suggested they were from an earlier era, perhaps 1820s or 1830s, decades before the Ashfords even lived in Millbrook, which raised the horrifying question, who were they, and why were they buried with the Ashford family? A local historian named Gerald Morrison became obsessed with this mystery. He spent years researching, going through every record he could find. In 1967, he published a small, self-printed booklet titled The Millbrook Enigma. In it, he proposed a theory that has never been definitively proven or disproven. Morrison suggested that the Ashford property had been the site of something long before William and Catherine built their house. He pointed to Native American oral histories from the Lenape people who had inhabited the region before European settlement. According to these histories, the area where Millbrook now stood was considered cursed ground, a place where the barrier was thin, where things from the other side could cross over more easily. Morrison claimed he'd found references in Lenape stories to a feeding ground, a place in the deep forest where offerings were left to appease entities that lived in the darkness between worlds. These weren't gods, weren't spirits in the traditional sense. They were older than that, hungry things that existed in the spaces between life and death. Whether Catherine Ashford knew this history, whether she deliberately chose that location, or whether she stumbled into something that had been waiting there all along, we cannot know. But the evidence suggests that she wasn't the first to make bargains with whatever dwelled in those woods. And the 5 bodies buried with her family might have been offerings from someone else, decades earlier, someone who'd made the same terrible mistake, because carved into every doorframe, every windowsill, were symbols that no one in Millbrook had ever seen before, except one person, Herman Schneider, Catherine's brother, and he recognized them because he'd seen them before in a book his grandmother had brought from Bavaria in 1789, a book of binding spells, a book that taught you how to make contracts with things that should never be contacted, a book that, according to Anna Schmidt's testimony, Catherine had stolen from her father's house in the fall of 1864. The discovery of the mass grave in 1952 should have brought closure. Instead, it opened new wounds and raised questions that would haunt researchers for decades to come. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. State police descended on Millbrook, a town that by 1952 had grown to nearly 800 residents, most of whom had no knowledge of what had happened in 1865. The few elderly residents who remembered were children or teenagers at the time of the tragedy, and they claimed ignorance. The official line was simple. A family had died of unknown causes during the Civil War, been buried and forgotten. The additional bodies, perhaps victims of a different tragedy, buried at the same location. But some people knew better. In 1954, a package arrived at the offices of the Altoona Mirror newspaper. It was postmarked from Pittsburgh but had no return address. Inside was a water-damaged journal and a brief note typed on an old typewriter. This belonged to Reverend Jonas Whitmore. It should have been destroyed with the rest. But someone kept it. Someone always keeps something. The truth deserves to be known. The journal covered the years 1863 to 1867. Most entries were mundane, recordings of births, marriages, deaths, sermons delivered. But scattered throughout were entries that had been heavily redacted, entire. Pages torn out, passages scratched through with such violence that the pen had carved grooves into the paper beneath. What remained was fragmentary but damning. November 12th, 1864. Catherine Ashford came to me today in great distress. She confessed to practices that, had they been spoken in earlier times, would have seen her burned. I told her to cease immediately, to pray for forgiveness. She wept and said she could not stop now, that the protections must be maintained or something worse would come. I did not understand her meaning then. God help me, I do now. December 25th, 1864. No Christmas joy in my heart this year. I have seen what Catherine has drawn in that house. I recognize the symbols from my studies at seminary. They are from the grimoires, the forbidden texts we were taught to recognize, so we might burn them if found. But Catherine did not learn these from books. She learned them from her grandmother, who learned them in the old country. And they are working. Heaven help us, they are working. March 16th, 1865. Today we buried evil itself. May God forgive us for what we have chosen to do, but I cannot see another path. If the authorities come, if the true nature of what happened becomes known, panic will spread. They will say witchcraft. They will say demonic possession. They will say the town itself is cursed. We will be destroyed, not by what Catherine did, but by the fear of it. So we have chosen silence, and I pray that silence holds. The most disturbing entry was dated March 20th, 1865, 4 days after the burial. Henry Corbett came to me in the night, claiming he saw lights in the forest where we buried the Ashfords. He wanted to dig them up, to see if we had made a mistake, if perhaps one of them had been alive. I forbade it, because I know what those lights are. I have seen them myself, and they are not lanterns carried by the living. The journal ended abruptly in May 1865. No explanation for why Whitmore stopped writing. He continued as Millbrook's Reverend until 1889, when he died of natural causes at age 73. His obituary made no mention of the Ashford family. In 1963, the same year Dr. Pierce's hidden documents were discovered, another piece of the puzzle emerged. A woman named Dorothy Langford, granddaughter of George Langford, who had led the cover-up in 1865, contacted the Pennsylvania Historical Society. She was 86 years old and dying of cancer. She wanted, she said, to unburden her conscience. Dorothy had been given a tin box by her father on his deathbed in 1932. He told her to destroy it, never to open it. But she'd kept it, hidden in her attic for 31 years. Now, facing her own mortality, she felt compelled to reveal its contents. Inside the box were photographs, 12 photographs to be exact, taken sometime in the late 1860s or early 1870s based on the photographic process used. They showed the interior of a house, clearly the Ashford house, based on architectural details visible in the frames. The photographs were horrifying. Every wall was covered in symbols, not just a few, as had been suggested by earlier accounts. Every single surface. The symbols were carved so deep into the wood that they created shadows in the photographs, giving the walls a ridged, almost scaled appearance. In one photograph, the children's bedroom, the symbols had been carved into the bed frame, the floor, even the ceiling. Another photograph showed the attic space. In the center of the floor was a large circle, approximately 8 feet in diameter, made from what appeared to be ash or charcoal. Within the circle were more symbols, and at specific points around the circumference were objects, bones, bundles of dried plants, what looked like small fabric dolls. The most disturbing photograph showed the root cellar where William's body had been found. The stone walls were covered in scratch marks, as described. But what earlier accounts hadn't mentioned was what William had been scratching. He wasn't trying to claw his way out. He was carving the same symbols that covered the rest of the house, over and over in desperate, bloody repetition. The Pennsylvania Historical Society preserved these photographs, but they've rarely been publicly displayed. They're available for research purposes, but you need special permission to view them. I've seen them. I can tell you that no reproduction, no description, adequately conveys the feeling of looking at those images. There's something wrong about them on a visceral level, something that makes your eyes want to slide away, your mind want to reject what it's seeing. In 1971, a graduate student in anthropology from Penn State University named Michael Torres decided to investigate the Millbrook case for his thesis. He spent 6 months in the area, interviewing elderly residents, searching through archives, trying to piece together a coherent narrative. Torres's thesis, Collective Trauma and Historical Erasure, the Millbrook Incident of 1865, was completed in 1972. It's housed in the Penn State Library and runs to over 300 pages. But the most valuable part isn't in the thesis itself, it's in Torres's field notes, which were donated to the university archives after his death in 2003. Torres had managed to find and interview 5 individuals whose grandparents had been alive in Millbrook in 1865. 3 of them refused to speak on record, but 2 provided testimony that Torres recorded on audio tape. Clarence Pritchard, age 79, grandson of Robert Pritchard, who owned the mill. My grandfather told me just once what he saw in that house. He was drunk, which was the only time he ever talked about it. He said the bodies weren't dead, not the way dead should be. He said their eyes followed him. He said when they carried Catherine's body out to the wagon, she was still warm, and when he touched her hand to move her, he swore he felt her fingers close around his, just for a second, then nothing. He never went near the forest after that, wouldn't even look in that direction. Eleanor Brenner, age 82, granddaughter of Wilhelm Brenner, who had fled the town. My grandfather left because of what he saw the night they buried the Ashfords. He'd gone out into the woods, following the torches, wanting to see what they were doing. He hid behind trees and watched them dig the grave. He said the men were terrified, working as fast as they could. Barely speaking, when they lowered the bodies into the hole, my grandfather said something happened. The forest went silent, not quiet, silent. Every sound stopped. No wind, no animals, nothing, and then he heard singing, not from the men, from somewhere else, from deeper in the forest, a woman's voice, singing in a language he didn't recognize. The men heard it too. They buried those bodies so fast they barely covered them properly, then ran. My grandfather ran too. He packed his family and left that very night. Torres tried to follow up on these testimonies to find corroborating evidence, but he kept hitting dead ends. Records were missing, witnesses had died, buildings that might have contained evidence had burned down in convenient fires. It was, he noted in his field notes, as if something or someone was actively working to ensure the truth stayed buried. Torres's final entry in his field notes, dated April 15, 1972, reads, "I'm terminating my research. Something isn't. Right here. I've started having dreams about the Ashford house, about the symbols, about voices singing in the dark. I've never experienced anything like this. I'm a rational person, a scientist. But I can't shake the feeling that by investigating this, by bringing attention to it, I'm doing something dangerous. I'm leaving Millbrook tomorrow, and I'm not coming back." He never did, and he never published his thesis. It sat in the university archives, unread and forgotten, until a researcher stumbled across it in 2003. The last major piece of evidence emerged in 1987, when the forest where the Ashford property had stood was partially logged for timber. Workers clearing land discovered the foundation of the original house, buried under decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. Archaeologists were brought in to excavate the site. What they found confirmed the photographic evidence and added new details. The symbols weren't just carved into the wood, they were carved into the stone foundation, into the chimney bricks, even into pieces of pottery and metal tools found in the ruins. More disturbing was what they found in a hidden space beneath the foundation. A small chamber, possibly a cold storage area, that had been sealed with stones. Inside were remains, animal bones mostly, rabbits, deer, birds, but also human bones, small ones, children's bones. The forensic analysis suggested they were very old, possibly predating the Ashford house by a century or more. And wrapped around these bones, preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the sealed chamber, was a piece of fabric. When it was carefully unfolded, it revealed writing. Not English, not German. A language that linguists at the University of Pennsylvania eventually identified as an archaic dialect of Bavarian German mixed with symbols from much older Germanic runes. The translation, approximate and uncertain, read, "The bargain is sealed, life for protection, blood for blessing, but beware the hunger that never sleeps, feed it or become the feast." The chamber was resealed. The site was covered again. No official report was ever filed with the state. The archaeologists involved, when later questioned, claimed they couldn't recall the details clearly. It was as if, even decades later, the silence continued to protect itself. So what really happened to the Ashford family in March of 1865? After everything we've uncovered, after all the documents, testimonies, photographs, and archaeological evidence, we still don't have a definitive answer, and perhaps that's exactly how it should be, because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some truths are better left buried. But let's examine the theories that have emerged over the decades of investigation. Theory 1. Folk magic gone wrong. The most commonly accepted explanation among researchers is that Catherine Ashford, drawing on folk traditions passed down through her German family, attempted protective rituals that spiraled out of control. In this interpretation, Catherine wasn't evil or malicious. She was a mother desperate to protect her family in a dangerous world. The Civil War was raging. Disease was rampant. Death was everywhere. Perhaps she turned to the old ways, the forbidden ways, seeking some measure of control over forces beyond her understanding. The symbols, the offerings, the sealed chamber beneath the house, they all suggest a practice of folk magic or hexerai that escalated beyond Catherine's ability to manage. Perhaps the things that visited the house weren't supernatural at all, but manifestations of collective hysteria, poisoning from ergot fungus or other natural hallucinogens, or even mass psychosis brought on by isolation and fear. This theory is comforting because it keeps everything within the realm of human error and natural explanation. But it doesn't account for everything. It doesn't explain the 12 bodies instead of 7. It doesn't explain the ancient bones beneath the foundation, or why that specific location seemed to attract tragedy across multiple generations. Theory 2. The murder cover-up. Some investigators have proposed a darker, more human explanation. What if the Ashfords were murdered? What if someone in Millbrook, perhaps jealous of their land or angry about Catherine's medical practice, which might have competed with the town doctor, decided to eliminate them? The symbols, the occult staging, the deliberate destruction of evidence could all have been an elaborate cover-up designed to make the death seem supernatural rather than criminal. In this scenario, the town's leaders didn't cover up witchcraft. They covered up murder. They burned the house and destroyed records to hide their own involvement, or the involvement of someone they were protecting. The oath of silence, the families who fled, the decades of erasure, all make sense if what happened was a crime that implicated the most powerful people in the community. But this theory also has gaps. It doesn't explain the consistent reports of strange phenomena before the deaths, the letters Catherine received, the disturbances that led to official complaints, and it certainly doesn't explain why, even a century later, people who investigated the case reported experiencing their own disturbing phenomena. Theory 3. Something ancient and hungry. The third theory is the one that most people don't want to consider. It's the theory that suggests Catherine Ashford stumbled into something real, something old, something that existed in those woods long before Europeans arrived in Pennsylvania. The Lenape stories about cursed ground, the ancient bones beneath the house, the pattern of tragedy at that specific location spanning generations. What if there was something there? Not a demon in the Christian sense, not a ghost or spirit, but something older and stranger. An entity that existed in the thin places between worlds, that required offerings to maintain some kind of a balance or boundary. Catherine, in her desperation, might have found a way to communicate with it, to make a bargain. Protection for her family in exchange for feeding its endless hunger. But like all bargains with forces beyond human comprehension, the terms were not what she thought they were. The protection came with a price she couldn't pay. And when she tried to stop, when the offerings became too costly, when she realized the true nature of what she'd invited into her home, it was already too late. The entity took what it was promised, all of them, and possibly 5 others from an earlier time who had made the same terrible mistake. Which theory is correct? We may never know. Millbrook still exists today, though the town has changed dramatically since 1865. The forest where the Ashford house stood is now part of a state recreation area. Hikers walk trails that pass within yards of where that mass grave was discovered in 1952. Most of them have no idea what they're walking over. The official records remain incomplete. Documents are still missing. Witnesses are long dead. The truth, if it was ever written down, was likely destroyed by people who believed silence was safer than knowledge. But every few years, someone new discovers the story. A researcher, a student, a local historian. They start asking questions, digging through archives, trying to piece together what really happened, and almost without exception, they eventually stop. They abandon their research. They leave town. They never speak of it again. To this day, no one knows the complete truth about what happened to the Ashford family. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part of all. Not the mystery itself, but the possibility that some mysteries exist, because the truth is too dangerous to know. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey into America's forgotten history. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about the secrets your own town might be hiding, or the histories that have been deliberately erased, leave a comment below and share your thoughts with our haunted community. What do you think happened to the Ashfords? Was it folk magic, murder, or something far stranger? Your theories matter. Your voice adds to the investigation. If you want more stories like this, if you want to continue exploring the darkest corners of American history where truth and terror intertwine, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because there are more buried secrets waiting to be uncovered, more silenced voices that deserve to be heard. Until next time, remember, history is written by the survivors, but sometimes the survivors are the ones with the most to hide. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and perhaps, just perhaps, stay away from the deep woods.